Foreign Entanglements viewers. My name is Robert Farley. I am an assistant professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. With me today is Nate Jones of the National Security Archive, or the blog National Security Archive. Actually, I think it's like subtitled Redacted or something interesting.
Unredacted. Unredacted.
Unredacted.
We don't like redaction.
So why don't you? Right. Why don't you introduce your work and yourself?
So my name's Nate. Nate Jones. I work at the National Security Archive, which, despite the fancy name, is a non-government organization that fights against secrecy, and we file about 2,000 FOIA requests a year and get tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of pages of declassified documents and analyze them and publish them. So I'm the FOIA coordinator, which means that I kind of keep my finger on what kind of FOIA requests work, what don't, how to write great appeals, what agencies are releasing, what aren't. And then I also am the editor of our blog, Unredacted, which is basically where we find cool documents and write about them.
Right. And we'll have a link to Unredacted off of the when we post this Dear vlog. So, I guess to start with, what guides your... so what principles of finding stuff out and discovering information about, particularly the Cold War, but even other stuff, what guides your interest, right? Is some of it just personal interest and stuff that you find really kind of cool, or are you more engineered towards, this is information that must be free because people must understand this, or so what guides your work?
I would say it's both. I can tell you how I got into it. Was
Sure.
Maybe some of your viewers will know, I've heard of this, but as an undergrad and then also as a graduate student, I was researching and writing my thesis on this thing called the so-called Able Archer 83 War Scare. And that basically, most historians would say that's the second most dangerous time in the Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But as I was doing my research and combing through the archives, and it happened in 1983, I found that so much information was classified. So we couldn't find this history, and I couldn't find this history. On one level, it was annoying because I'm trying to write a paper. And on the other, it's very disturbing that the government seems to be saying that we don't have a right to know. So I started asking the archivists, how can I get the stuff out? And some of them would try and help me and tell me a little bit about FOIA, but even they didn't know. And a lot of them would laugh and say, oh, it's classified, it's not coming out. So that frustration on two levels, personal and as a citizen, led me to the National Security Archive, where, one, they already had lots of these documents collected and stored, so I combed through those eagerly. And two, they got these not out of the kindness of the government, but by fighting and knowing the ins and outs of FOIA. That's the Freedom of Information Act, which is a law that you can use to request documents. And basically, I came here as a researcher, became an intern, and haven't got kicked out yet. So basically, the government kind of may have screwed itself by its non-release of documents has turned me into a bit of a fighter to get as many out as possible.
Right. It's interesting. My own work, or at least sort of my most academic work, has to do with anti-submarine warfare.
Oh, wow.
And especially from the Cold War, there's a ton of stuff about anti-submarine warfare that remains classified. And some of this is justifiably classified, but as a lot of my work also involves World War I and World War II, and it turns out that even some of the stuff from World War I and World War II about anti-submarine warfare techniques against 1942 class Type 7 German U-boats remains unavailable. And the archive I was working with, they were all nice people, historians are nice people, and they say, whatever you do, don't do a FOIA request because it's going to make our lives hell if you do a FOIA request for this information that was produced in 1943, right? And that obviously has no relevance for national security. And it seems to me that a lot, I guess, here's my question, how much of your work in terms of finding stuff is stuff that is classified just for absolutely no good reason, right? Just that somebody classified it way back when, it no longer needs to be, or it was accidentally classified. I guess how much, what would you say in terms of percentages is,
Well, I'll give you.
And I don't want to say malicious, but go ahead.
I'll give you someone else's figure, and then I'll give you my figure. In testimony to Congress, Don Rumsfeld, well, I'll let him speak for himself, said that probably of all the classified documents in the world, 50% need not be. I would go higher and say probably closer to 90%. And I don't know if it's so much malicious, but maybe willful neglect. The problem is that, I'm going to use a pejorative term, the securocrats in our government are unwilling to embrace historic automatic declassification. Even, I'm not going to get into the weeds too much, but there are executive orders saying that they should, and they just won't. And I don't really know why. It could be because they're so fearful that something from World War I or World War II could hurt our national security interests. I, in this case, am not going to give them the benefit of the doubt on that. I think that they like having the power to themselves use their own eyes and basically be the censors, and they won't release any document without reading everything themselves. And that's the easier, older documents. One example for you. The oldest classified document on the book, until recently, and still a little bit, was a World War I era document. And it wasn't an American document. It was French and German documents that the Central Intelligence Agency took the liberty of classifying, even though it didn't exist during World War I. And these documents were the French and German techniques for making invisible ink and opening letters in French and German. And the National Archive, the official archive, yeah, let's get this out the door. We want to not have this old classification on books. And the CIA said nope. And I think mostly it's just because they don't want to ever set the precedent of ever declassifying anything. So there was a big fight, and the National Archive was pushing. Colleagues of the National Security Archive did these requests and went to court and went to arbitration. And finally, at the last second, the CIA released these documents and did a big press release and patted themselves on the back for how great they are and made it look like they had made the huge step forward. But really, what had happened was they lost the fight. And the one...
Right, they've been beaten into submission.
Yeah, but the one thing that really made them lose the fight, and who knows, they might still be classified if not for this, these same documents were available on Google Scholar and Google Books. At the same time, the CIA was spending a lot of attorney money trying to keep these World War I era documents secret. So, yeah, that kind of makes you angry. And if you see that they do that for those documents, it kind of makes you wonder what they do with other documents as well.
Now, I want to get a little bit later because I'm sure you have some interesting stories, and I want to hear. We like stories here at Plugging Things, but to what extent has sort of your work and the work of other people like you and other organizations like yours is it changing the equation? Is it changing the struggle over classified documents? And I guess a different way to frame this would be to, are activists in the digital age rendering classification an entirely different prospect than what it once was? Is it harder to keep stuff secret now than it has been in the past?
I don't think so. And the reason is because the agencies have not been forced into the digital age yet. So their systems are very analog. The CIA just finally started using email for FOIA requests, I believe, last week. And it's a welcome step, but come on, guys, it's 2013. You should have been doing that in 1993. And there's very little oversight, and they have systems in place. And it's like a lot of things in life. They just say, this is our system. We're not going to change it. People point out that the number of documents is rising exponentially with the creation of email, but the same pace of declassification is very linear, and it's already behind. We can talk about the National Declassification Center, which is about to fail a presidential order within the coming months. But they're not changing their ways. and it's frustrating. And the sad answer to your question is, despite the declassification activists and communities kicking and screaming, we haven't seen marked improvement.
Right. I mean, here's a second and associated question, because you just mentioned the sort of the proliferation of additional documents because of email.
Mm-hmm.
Is there could there be a point reached where sort of declassification activism runs up against just this massive noise problem, that there's just, and perhaps you've already run up against this, right, that there's just so much information out there that it's hard to figure out what's relevant in terms of sort of any kind of interesting story or any sort of politically relevant thing to find out, right? That they just have to sift through thousands of emails, some of which are only 2 lines.
Yep.
And that, I mean, I guess does the proliferation of documents make your job harder?
Well, I guess the short answer is yes. But 2 points. One, there's technology also can maybe make that easier, which we see the rise in use of e-discovery tools, and those could be applied to emails, or even there's this isn't declassification, but it's a good example of the Wikileaks Iraq war logs. Associated Press a while back used these great, I think, very similar to e-discovery, to, without reading them all, because there's hundreds of thousands of pages, to kind of map them all and see which words come up, and use, I guess, artificial intelligence to help make sense of them, or put it out there so that when someone knows what they're specifically looking for, they can look through it. So it's a gift and a curse. And the second point I would want to make is that, again, instead of reading every email line by line before you declassify it, there has to be an automatic sunset or sunshine date of 10 years is fine. And of course, for all my classified listeners out there, we're not talking about sources and methods, which would be top secret. We're not talking about WD information, of course not. We're talking about just normal classified material. Should not be, and the President Obama said he's not doing much about it, should not remain classified indefinitely. In fact, it should be declassified automatically after a set period.
Right. Now, you just said 10 years, and yeah, I work at a Patterson School, which is a foreign policy school, and a lot of people go into the intelligence community.
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine people who would be broadly sympathetic with the argument, and who would also say that 10 years is far too short of a period for sunsetting classification.
Well, okay, the status quo is, in the example of invisible ink, is 100 years. So I would personally push that back to 25 years, fine. But also I would say that classification right now, if something is classified as confidential, which most of the WikiLeaks diplomatic cables that were classified were, the vast bulk, I believe close to 200,000 of them were unclassified, and then of the remaining, I believe 10,000 of them, most of those were confidential. The date for that on paper is 5 years, but it's not automatic. They have to review it line through line, and then if it's classified as secret, the next higher level is 10 years, and top secret is 25 years. But despite those dates, even the declassifiers seem not to be relying on them.
Right. I mean, the dates are irrelevant if they still have to be sifted through line by line. So. Yep.
More than that, sorry. It's even if something has a top secret date of 25 years, the law is such that it can only be classified so long as it harms U.S. national security, which is subjective. But a good example is a war plan. It can be classified, and then the day after you do the plan, it's no longer need to be classified.
Right. So you mentioned WikiLeaks, and I guess before we get to the interesting story portion, tell me sort of what you think. How does your work relate to WikiLeaks' work? Obviously you guys are doing different things, but there's still sort of an information is free aspect to it. What do you think is the relationship between what you do and what your organization does and what WikiLeaks does?
Well, unlike some of my colleagues in the federal government that aren't even allowed or will not mention or talk about WikiLeaks, I'm going to do so, but I'm going to say my opinion, not my organization. So everything I'm saying now is my opinion.
Right.
I have a great respect for them. And whenever we are doing our targeted FOIA requests, and just as an aside, it's always better, we think, to do targeted, very specific, rather than a shotgun broad. I read the WikiLeaks cables and see which other cables they reference, where they are. They're a great tool for journalists, and as anyone that reads the Post or the Times knows that, for example, when someone writes about a Abbottabad, these journalists will type in a Abbottabad and see what cables come up and make note of them at the end of their stories, which is great. And of course, WikiLeaks aren't the only leaks that we deal with and are grateful for. We wouldn't know almost anything about our current foreign policy without so-called traditional leaks, be they authorized or unauthorized. And a lot of my organization's FOIA requests come from reading the paper, seeing the name of a document, or reading between the lines and seeing that a document likely exists and requesting it. And most of those come from leaks. Frankly, with WikiLeaks or any other leaks, they're essential to democratic and open society and an informed public.
So I don't know if I want to call this exactly story time, but tell me some of the most interesting stuff you found. And I am especially interested in Able Archer, right? I mean, Able Archer is very fascinating exercise in the political implications of it. So what kind of cool stories can you tell about sort of the stuff that's come out and how that's changed our historical understanding of particular events?
Well, one example, if we're talking about historical understanding, there's a great article that from my boss, my director, that hopefully you can link to. Basically, it's a historiography about our whole evolving knowledge via declassification and other means of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And as a kid like me and maybe you, I started going, when I went to college, I kind of assumed that this history of the CMC had been kind of out there forever, but reading this, it really shows that it was a struggle, and that includes the fairly recent revelations that there were the Soviets with tactical nukes, which are nukes that you could essentially launch with the trigger pointed at the U.S., and had the U.S. invaded, there's very high likelihood that orders from Moscow or not, they would have shot those nukes right at Guantanamo Bay, which was our property. And it's just so that's one story of the danger. Here's not a story, but a frustrating example. I pulled this out specifically. Here's a request we did. I don't know how old it was, but probably pretty old. So we did it 2006, got it last week. The CIA publishes routinely every month a terrorism review, which I'm showing on the screen now. Let's see here. And that's basically a in-house kind of review that they send around everyone. So if there's an attack currently if there's an attack in Syria, they probably would use mostly news reports and just summarize everything and send it around, or attack in Latin America that we might not know about, and it's a good reference. So anyways, we requested, out of interest, the terrorism review for November of 2001. It's pretty important, and we wanted to see how this periodical treated the 9/11 attacks. And of course, we've had the 9/11 Commission. You can look on our website. We have reams and reams and reams of documents about 9/11. Even declassified the President's Daily Brief, which the CIA hated. But anyways, in this case, if you flip to the United States, bear with me. which would be the September 11th attacks. You have this, and it's about 6 more pages of that, and not a single word.
Mm-hmm.
So, frustrating. The CIA still seems to think that America was attacked on 9/11 is classified.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not a story, but that's the frustrations that we're dealing with. And I think part of the reason I show that is I think more people should be frustrated about it. And as long as it's just a small niche of declassification-minded people, there needs to be more outrage.
Right. Now, part of this niche, I imagine, sort of you have, sort of on one side the activist side, but you also probably people like myself, like academics who,
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Just need this to write their dissertations and, can't find the relevant information or can't get the information to cross-check the information they have and everything else. So, why don't you tell the story? Can you tell the story of Able Archer?
Sure,
so
yeah.
Everybody's on board.
I joke with my friends. I'm often a 3-trick pony. Able Archer, FOIA, and Denver Broncos football. So I'll just kind of go into pub.
We're not going to talk about Denver Broncos.
But I'll go into pub mode and talk about Able Archer.
Okay.
So basically, in 1983, Ronald Reagan, a very fiery Ronald Reagan, was president in the U.S. And gave a lot of speeches saying they're going to put the Soviets in the ash bin of history. That communism was against God and born in the Garden of Eden with sin. And at the same time he was doing that, he was upgrading the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Carter had done PD-59, which was a first strike doctrine. And on the Soviet side, Brezhnev, after the long era of stagnation, had died, and Andropov, who was also very sick, was in charge and not very stable. And most of this information now comes from a pretty high-level Soviet KGB agent stationed in London called Oleg Gordievsky, who was turned by British intelligence, who shared this intelligence with the U.S. And he was saying that the coalition of world forces, and we have some KGB documents that back this up, had shifted so that the Soviets were genuinely afraid, for right or wrong, that the U.S. might launch a first strike against them. And because of this, they started this program, Operation Ryan, which is Rakieta Yapadenia Yaderna Napadenia. I think it's right. My Russian is put me on the spot there, which translates to nuclear missile attack. And what that meant was that starting in 1981 and going on through 1983, Soviet KGB agents abroad, their number one priority wasn't working with back-channel contacts with Americans or watching diplomats or using propaganda. It was looking for indicators that a nuclear attack might happen. Part of this was because there was a new series of missiles that was imminently or just in Western Europe that could hit Moscow in six minutes before the leaders get to their bunkers. So they thought, maybe irrationally, maybe rationally, that you had to rely on human intelligence instead of other forms of intelligence to find out if the U.S. was going to launch. So, at the same time this was going on, there is an exercise called Able Archer. Now it's called Able Archer. At the time it was called something different, and that's part of the reason for the historical confusion, which was a NATO nuclear release exercise that was more realistic than ever before, and more than that, it could have masked M-A-S-K-E-D, an actual attack, a ruse of war. And this is in the Soviet doctrine that if an attack was coming, it might be masked by a drill. And Cap Weidenberger on the U.S. side said the same thing, that was a U.S. fear. So in this very tense situation, fears were heightened more and more. CIA reports say that Soviets put their nuclear-capable aircraft on high alert, stopped broadcasting weather broadcasts, stopped sending trucks to help the harvest, which they saw with satellite imagery, and basically the situation kind of resolved itself quietly. We don't know how. There's a 100-page, still classified report that probably sheds more light on this. But involved, the danger was over. It was probably not near as high as during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but even that we now know never. The eyeball-to-eyeball moment in the Caribbean never actually happened. We now know. But there is still worry on the U.S. side, and they started writing these intelligence reports based on this guy Gordievsky's reporting, basically saying, what happened? Could the Soviets really fear us and think we could launch an attack? We're the good guys. And the key thing is that President Reagan read these reports and was fascinated by them and scared by them, and wrote in his diaries things along the line of saying, I had never assumed that that the Soviets would ever think we would attack them. I think the quote goes, what the hell do they have that we would want? Or something like that. But then the next line is, but that got me thinking that I have to do everything I can do to ensure them that this would never happen. And subsequently, it led to vastly improved relations and reduction of the nuclear stockpile and the end of the Cold War. So,
right. I mean, oh, go ahead.
The last takeaway is, the real point is how close or dangerous the situation was, and too dangerous for my liking. Andropov warned in one speech with the U.S. envoy 4 times of fear of nuclear miscalculation, which is a real fear. But despite that, that's one takeaway. The other is that it got through to the president and changed his view of foreign policy towards the Soviets.
Right. And it sort of changes some of our understanding of that late portion of the Cold War. I mean, it's interesting to me because, a lot of the fiction that came out in the early 1980s about, I guess, I have 2 semi-historical takeaways, and then I want to jump, I sort of want to switch the order of what we were going to talk about.
Sure.
A lot of the literature about the Third World War and what the Third World War might look like in the early 1980s was premised around a war being launched out of something like a mobilization exercise. So, I mean, to my recollection, that was in like Sir John Hackett's Third World War. It was a Soviet mobilization exercise that led to war. In Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising, again, there was a deceptive Soviet mobilization exercise that produced war. And so other people were thinking along these lines too. It's just that Americans, or at least it seemed at the time, weren't thinking about it in terms of an American exercise could produce this sort of instability.
Yeah. And then also the other part of it is that it wasn't just people in a bunker playing nuclear war, kind of like a war game scenario. The U.S. moved tons and tons and tons of troops and hundreds of thousands of troops to Europe right before, and tons and tons and tons of aircrafts and tanks to simulate a conventional war turned nuclear. So there was a lot of stuff. If you are a Soviet watching, there's a lot of stuff that you couldn't completely follow. Yeah, I'm agreeing with you.
Right. And then there's also, I'm reading, I think it's Jeffrey Roberts or Jeffrey Williams, his book on the career of Zhukov. And it talks a lot about how the sort of Operation Barbarossa was interpreted in Soviet military thought.
Yeah.
And sort of much of the argument here said, not completely unreasonably, that the German army was not that much better than the Russian army. The Russian army was bigger, it had better equipment, that the German army was able to score these profound victories in 1941 because they were able to launch a surprise offensive, right? That they were able to take the offensive against the Red Army. And so then you can sort of, when you then rethink that and, well, okay, it's the Germans again, this time with the Americans and so forth.
Well,
right?
that's fascinating because of a recent CIA document that we got disclosed, I think, for the first time that along with this guy Gordievsky, they had a Czechoslovak source. And his main point to his handlers was the same thing. Operation Barbarossa, the Soviets it's everyone's talking about it, everyone's thinking about it. That is how they are thinking right now, and his handlers just couldn't really understand that until after the fact.
Right, and even in 1983, right? I mean, somebody in the Soviet High Command is 55 years old, 60 years old. It's only 40 years, and so they quite likely have some experience directly from the Second World War. And this is actually probably also true in the Bundeswehr, that you probably have senior commanders in the Bundeswehr who were there in 1943 as well, and so that kind of paranoia is more understandable. On this issue of paranoia, I want to jump.
Sure.
Because we were going to talk about TV last, but I want to talk about it now because it's very interesting.
Cool.
So I think you have been, and we'll get to the Oscar stuff still at the end.
Cool.
I think you have been watching this new show on FX called The Americans.
Yeah, right up my alley.
Right up your alley. No, right up the alley of this conversation. Yeah. So the premise is that it's like Kerry Russell and Matthew Rhys, I think is his name. And the premise here is that you have KGB sleeper agents in the United States who've taken on American identities and who are feeding information back to the Soviet Union. And the time frame is exactly where you are right now, right? It's exactly in 1981-82, right after the election of Reagan. And I think the last episode was the assassination attempt of Reagan.
Yeah, wonderful episode with the Al Haig playing through and through and through. It's one of the best historical TV episodes I've ever seen. Yeah.
Right. No, it was fantastic because I had never thought about those events, what those events might have looked like from a Soviet perspective. And I don't know how accurate the show is in terms of depicting that perspective, but it would not at all be unreasonable for the Soviets to look at this and say, "Oh my God, do we have a military coup here?" As
Andropov said, the danger of miscalculation.
Right. So I know. Do you love this? I guess do you love this show as much as I do? Through 4 episodes, I guess.
Yeah.
So far, maybe 3 episodes. I know. There's another episode tonight. So.
Yeah, I like it a lot, but that's not a surprise because it's right up my alley. I think it's I don't know how realistic it is either. I think the one biggest hang up is the perfect English speaking. But if you get past that, it might not be accurate, but they at least read their history and are basing it off the right stuff. I'm not so sure that there were ever sleeper agents like that. But as a plot device, I'll let that slide because the other stuff is pretty dead on. There were reports of weapons caches in at least Western Europe, maybe not in the U.S. That was in the last episode, so that's a good throwback. How they signaled their handlers with antennas, I think that was accurate, the treatment again of using the actual footage of the Al Haig speech and how a Soviet would view that, and how the sleeper agents on the ground, they basically knew it was nothing. The KGB officers stationed in Washington were a little bit less in the loop, but they probably knew it was nothing. But the people back in Moscow that had never set foot in the U.S. give a report that Al Haig says he's in charge, and they take that and run and think that it's a military coup. I think that captures the misunderstanding. Also, one gripe though, and this is they're not as bad as the show Homeland, but for Pete's sake, any TV directors out there, if you are filming a show in Washington D.C. and you have something filmed on DuPont Circle, or you say the words DuPont Circle, you damn well better have filmed the actual DuPont Circle. It happens again and again and again. It happened in Homeland too. But as someone that lives in D.C., you can get away with some fudge. And I know filming on location is tricky, but just do not do that on DuPont Circle, please.
Right. Well, another aspect, and I think that this comes in with, and this draws the show into sort of a direct contrast with Homeland, is that in addition, so this KGB family lives in McLean, Virginia, and their next door neighbor in McLean, Virginia happens to be the family of an FBI agent. And one, that kind of will sound to you like an implausible coincidence, but if you've ever been to McLean, it's not implausible at all, right? I mean, it just seems so, or any of the suburbs like Potomac in Maryland, or so any of those others. You know, the idea that your next door neighbor might be part of the CIA or the FBI, right? And just, you know, that's what they do for a living, and they go to work and so forth. That is not at all unreasonable, right?
Not at all.
And so it's not this bizarre coincidence that this FBI guy lives next door. And the other thing is that, and this is really the distinction with Homeland, they get the FBI right. I mean, their FBI guy sounds like and looks like somebody who works for the FBI, right? And he goes to work, and the people who work with him, and the internal, that looks like the FBI might actually function. Whereas Homeland, which sort of initially started with a very interesting premise, got really terrible really quick. And one of the reasons it got terrible is because it's just incapable of depicting the CIA in any sort of realistic fashion. And it's also incapable of depicting CIA-FBI interaction in any kind of realistic fashion. Like, the organizational aspects of it make no sense whatsoever.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I guess.
No, I'm with you. It's
does any of that appeal to you?
You can tell that it's basically they had sets and directors left over from 24, so I wanted to just slap on a bit of a slightly sexier version of 24. I'm agreeing with you. I will not be tuning in for season 3 of Homeland. It's too much. Also, I think the hyper-flattering portrayal of CIA intelligence of 100% good guys versus bad guys really doesn't catch all of the real world aspects, hard to understand aspects of the war on terror when it's just good versus bad, almost spy versus spy like.
Right. Well, and it's just, you know, it's spy versus spy, and the CIA of Homeland it's like the unit. It's exactly like the unit in 24, right? It just conducts intelligence wherever it wants, anytime it wants, and is under no legal restriction, no matter what, right? And let's send a CIA agent to the vice president's inauguration because that's what we do apparently.
Yeah.
And the FBI is just a joke in Homeland, basically. And the Americans, I don't know what kind of ratings it's getting. I hope it gets renewed because it's awesome.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%.
So now that we've sort of broached this pop culture thing, let's talk about. So this year's Academy Awards had at least, sort of the two of most immediate interest to us and to this conversation in terms of Best Picture were obviously Zero Dark 30, and which I believe there's a post up about Zero Dark 30 at Unredacted.
Yep.
And Argo, and I believe there's another post up about Argo.
If you want people to read your writing, write about Hollywood.
Oh yeah, no question. Well, you know. And apparently, you know, blogging about Hollywood as well.
Yep.
So there were also, of course, I think there were I don't know the rest of the nominees. Lincoln obviously was a historical epic.
There's one more other interesting one that I haven't seen yet. I really want to see, and that's called No, and it's about in Chile, Pinochet's referendum or plebiscite where he wanted to elect himself president for life, and the opposition launched their campaign saying no, and I haven't seen it yet. But the National Security Archive does have a bunch of documents that's based on as well.
Oh, that's interesting. So was that like a foreign language film at the Oscars, or I mean, I haven't heard about it.
I haven't seen it yet, but I think it is foreign language. Didn't win, but I'm looking forward to seeing it. Yeah.
Right. So anyway, I guess. Why don't we start off by? Well, okay. Let's talk about this two ways.
Sure.
You know, obviously the debate over Zero Dark 30 has been more involved than the debate over Argo. You know, just because of the way that tortures. But I think since Argo won, people are starting to talk more about Argo now. I guess for someone like you who has some subject matter expertise in these areas, are you able to sit down and watch a movie like Zero Dark 30 or a movie like Argo or even a movie like Lincoln, and watch it as a movie without thinking this is what they get right, this is what they get wrong, this is what we know now that makes this make no sense. I mean, are you able to set aside your professional persona when you're taking in one of these movies?
Oh, no, not really, but I still enjoy them as movies, but I can't turn off my my historian sense. But I liked all three movies. All three weren't completely accurate, and I don't. In the case of Argo and Lincoln, Zero Dark 30 is a little bit different, but even that I don't begrudge them for trying to make money off of their movies, and you're not going to do that by having someone sitting there and reading an academic journal. So I'm fine with with most of the liberties they took.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, what were some of the liberties, especially in Argo? Let's start off with Argo. Like,
let's see. Yeah,
there's some stuff out there, but what are the most important liberties you think?
Okay, well, and I like the movie a lot. It was great. But in the last scene. And spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it yet, you're in trouble. In the last scene, they spend all of this time creating these fake legends, getting to the Iranian airport, having these fake passports, and they show them, and it's very stressful. There's 3 checkpoints, they say in the film. During this, the CIA in D.C. cancels and then uncancels the plane tickets. There's all these Revolutionary Guards hawking at people. They have to give them pictures to kind of appease them. Finally, they get on the plane. Then when the plane's taking off, the police and Revolutionary Guards chase them. It's almost like the old Dr. Dre video. Some people might know that. Okay, but what really happened that we know from the CIA's in-house journal, Studies in Intelligence, they had an article written, I'm not sure this was a while back, by Tony Mendez, who's the character that Ben Affleck plays, and he's still around and still doing interviews, and he's written a book too. But what really happened was they spent all this time doing these really good forgeries and really good identities. That's true. And then they went to the airport smartly at 5 in the morning, and the poor schmuck who had to work at 5 in the morning was so asleep that he stamped them and didn't look twice, and they got on the plane. So, still, kudos to the CIA for crafting these great fake identities, but there was no amount of drama like depicted. Just another couple, I wouldn't say inaccuracies, but differences. There was actually 2 CIA agents. This is all from the CIA history, not just one, so they wrote out another one. And the CIA was a little bit more incompetent in real life than portrayed in the film. A lot of Canadians have been up in arms saying that it was mostly Canadians. Even Jimmy Carter said it was 90% Canadian intel, and that's true. When the CIA they went to Canada, they got the Canadian intel to sign off and let them in, and the CIA showed them their forgeries. The Canadians actually said, oh, these are inferior to ours. In fact, you misdated this one because the CIA guy had, quote, misinterpreted the Farsi calendar. So the Canadians actually were better than the CIA agents. And one more thing, the day of the raid, Tony Mendez, Ben Affleck's character, he didn't call his wife or anything like that in the movie. He overslept. His alarm didn't work, so he woke up late. But it still was a very successful covert operation despite that. But those are some of the kind of fun details. And one more interesting coda, especially with the Oscars. And so setting up the fake movie studio, that was true, and really a fascinating story. Mm-hmm. So actually there's a quote in this article that hopefully you'll link to, that Mendes wrote, saying, oh, the Hollywood for ages has been a perfect place for the mafia and other shady people to invest their money with clever fronts. So it's a great place for the CIA to go. So they did that. They started a fake studio, made these fake posters. Actually, the film Argo was based on, I think The Lords of Light, a real book. And they started getting all of these scripts sent there. Well, one of the scripts was sent by Steven Spielberg. So Steven Spielberg, who lost to the film Argo for Best Picture, actually sent a script to that studio back in early 80s. So fascinating.
Oh, that's remarkable. Late
70s, rather. Yeah.
Right. maybe we'll have to talk some other time about sort of evaluating competence and thinking about competence and incompetence in terms of intelligence organizations. But anyway, so actually, that leads us to the next one, right? And I have seen Zero Dark 30. I haven't written about it yet. I've been planning to, and I just haven't gotten around to it. Zero Dark 30 is a little bit different in terms of, it's obviously much closer to us, and so the information we have is. We have, well, there are two problems with Zero Dark 30, right? One is that we have less of the relevant information that we need, and second is that we have so much information that it seems hard to sift through. And I think I read a couple days ago, something about there are 6 extant accounts of exactly how Osama bin Laden died. And it's very difficult to settle between all of those accounts because, in some cases they're all coming from the SEAL team, and they're all coming from different perspectives, and they differ in really important ways. For my own part, I enjoyed Zero Dark 30 while also appreciating the very problematic aspects of it. What were your thoughts on ZD3?
Well, it's about the same. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a good film. It had one huge flaw that everyone's talking about, and that is the torture scene. And I think that could have been fixed very easily. Instead of everything else is, we have a document here. Here's their interview with Vickers, who's Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. And with that, they wanted to double-check an email that the compound was right to the square inch. So in some aspects, they're very meticulous and very accurate, which I really liked. It was great. But in others, such as torture, they use a composite character when they very easily could have done a little bit more. It's not research because they did their research. And they could have used, for example, this guy, Ghoul, who gave them intelligence, but did so after he was tortured and didn't give anything up. They could have looked at the National Security Archive and others' documents and saw that sometimes people that were tortured gave some information. In this case, the guy was tortured and then gave the information afterwards. In the case of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he was tortured but still didn't say the name of the courier, and they actually also caught him sending secret messages saying don't say the name of the courier. But they should have just used a real person and not a composite.
Right. Obviously.
One more broader point is actually, and Argo did actually get, and this is about the access issue. First, Argo was allowed to film inside of Langley, which Zero Dark 30 wasn't. So that shows that the CIA had his fingers in 2 films, 2 Oscar-nominated films, and we now know from emails saying that they want to do this. And they want to have a positive image. And, if I was not an American, it would sure look fishy having Michelle Obama reading out that Argo won Best Picture. And as an American, I can kind of understand it, but as an Iranian, that would make me really upset. But also the issue I want to get to about Zero Dark 30 quickly is the issue of access. And the CIA and the White House and the DOD, they think that by providing access to Catherine Bigelow and Mark Bowl and writing this movie as, say it or don't say it, the definitive history of the raid that killed bin Laden, they want to do this film as the de facto history rather than release the documents or officially acknowledge or give a real history. And it's so frustrating that this guy Vickers that gave the interview to Bigelow and Bowl, that's now declassified and on our website, he actually got sanctioned for talking too much. And I think my point in the National Security Archive's point is that it's not that they're talking too much, it's that they're talking too little. And they're granting access to filmmakers and not putting this stuff on the public record. And that drives me bonkers.
Right, very, very selective accounts of what exactly happened. And Zero Dark 30 is also kind of interesting in that, the project began before Bin Laden was killed, right? I mean, this was in the
Yep.
it was subtitled something. It was titled something else, but
Tora Bora, I think it began as.
yeah, right, something along those lines. And it was it was, and I kind of like to think about it this way, that a lot of Bigelow's work is about frustration, and it was going to be about another one of these sort of frustrating accounts of sincere people trying to do sincere things, right? So
Right.
something similar to the Hurt Locker, something if you've seen K-19.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also a movie about frustration, right? Frustration and pointlessness, and people persisting in the face of frustration and pointlessness. And it obviously became something much different when Bin Laden was killed. And this, I'm going to, I guess, two more questions. One, and I bring up Lincoln because Lincoln is also about history, and Lincoln. There's an interesting comparison between Lincoln and these other two films, because Lincoln gets just as much stuff wrong, right? And just as much stuff just badly, baldly wrong, like the entire state of Connecticut, which is
Right.
apparently in an outrage about some basic stuff. What percentage of historical assign a number? Historical films get stuff wrong because of sort of intentional trying to structure the narrative on the part of people who have government access. They get it wrong because of the dramatic necessity of telling a story. But how much of it is just getting it wrong because they get it wrong, because historians disagree, or because the history isn't obvious, or because people just don't bother to check and see how the people from Connecticut voted on a particular day?
Well, there's I would say that the second one that you mentioned about historians not agreeing, or there's no record, so you have to make a good jump, that's less egregious than just getting the facts wrong or manipulating the facts. An Iranian criticism of Argo that's pretty good says that basically just even the Wikipedia page is more accurate on the initial scroll, say, in the brief history of the 53 overthrow. They get the Shah's name wrong. And stuff like that. So nothing is immune from everyone. Most films do it, unfortunately, and they should get criticized for that. But you do get to take artistic license. Even every biography I've ever read, the biographer uses some of his opinion, or better to say subjectivity, to fill in the gray areas and presume why, and I think that's all right. That's why I like reading and writing history, because it's not dictated from God up high. You gotta fill it in yourself. And films are like that too, in a slightly different way, but it's the same. I think it's the same thing.
Right. I guess last thing, did you actually watch the Oscars telecast?
Oh, I did. My buddy. I used to not care, but my buddy had an Oscars party. He's done it for 6 years, so I've finally seen him so many Oscars now. I think I'm an expert. Yeah, I did watch.
Yeah, I sort of unwillingly watched the. I was trying to do work, and the wife turned it on, and so I watched. What are you willing to voice an opinion on Seth MacFarlane's hosting of the Oscars, on the quality of his hosting?
Yeah, he was cracking me up, man. I thought he was
great. To answer
great.
This question, but
I thought he was great. How about you?
Yeah, because I asked that question for. I thought that the opening part where they brought Shatner on,
Oh yeah,
and then that was followed by whatever it was called, the boob song.
Yeah.
I thought that was sufficiently funny and sufficiently self-referential, and sufficiently referential to sort of other pop culture artifacts. So, specifically to Knocked Up, and the conversation in Knocked Up, that really felt to me that MacFarlane was, making fun of himself and making fun of Hollywood, in a very informed and potentially biting way. But I think that it degenerated. I think first that skit went on way too long, like the whole Shatner thing. I love William Shatner, but and it's not Shatner's fault, but I just think the whole thing went, as they kept coming back and back, it went on too long. And I think MacFarlane got worse over the course of it. I mean, I absolutely cringed when he made the comment about, Javier Bardem or Penelope Cruz or Salma Hayek. We don't pay attention. We don't care that we can't understand them because they're so beautiful. It's like, really? I mean,
yeah, he'll get some flack. He'll get some flack for that. Yeah.
I can understand Javier Bardem. He speaks fantastic English. He speaks much better English than I do Spanish. And the same with Penelope Cruz and the same with Salma Hayek. And so this is not a joke that appeals to me, right? I mean, and I guess I wonder if he was at the commercials backstage reading the tweets about it and sort of getting more defensive as the show went along. And I guess, I don't know, maybe we'll have a story about that sometime. But, I think a lot of the criticism of him is pretty fair. There were some aspects that I did enjoy.
But,
obviously, I guess I'm not going to do it again.
My taste may be more in the gutter than yours, but I like Ricky Gervais, too. I think the whole Hollywood institution, to me personally, is kind of sickening. And so I like someone whacking him down a notch or two in most circumstances, yeah. But no, I mean, he certainly was better than Billy Crystal, man. That guy put me to sleep. At least with Seth MacFarlane, I could watch to see if he's going to get himself in trouble.
Right. No, I mean, Billy Crystal is going to, bring about sort of a level of boring competence, which is probably why they try to move away from him. So, anyway, but, I think as people have said, it wouldn't be great for Tina Fey and Amy Poehler and so forth, and maybe we can do that at some point. Anyway, well, this has been a fantastic conversation, and we should have this again at some point when we have more unredacted stuff to plow through.
Yeah, my pleasures. I love talking documents.
All right. Well, Foreign Entanglements viewers, thank you very much. Nate, thank you very much. And we will see you all soon.